Okay, now I think we're recording. So somebody wave if you can hear me. Okay, excellent. All right, guys, tonight I have Dr. Robin Gould, and I asked her to join us tonight to help us draw to a conclusion some things that we talked about last week in terms of sexual immorality and how it's associated with passing your children through the fire to Molech. And this week we're going to tie it into another aspect of Molech, which is the cult of the dead and death things. And I know we see zombies and dead things, walking dead people everywhere, and I don't guess it's any coincidence that our children are gender confused because we're sowing them into mixed fields, basically, and they don't know who to imprint on because the wheat and the tare looks kind of the same and just as valid in a lot of cases. And so I asked Dr. Gould to come in and explain some things we talked about at Passover about, just the process that a child goes through so that we could see how the world is really opening up that realm of confusion to them so that they are having trouble identifying gender and so forth. So I'm going to turn it over to her. And then after that, we'll move right back into Kedoshim so we can see the other side of the story, which is the cult of the dead.
Okay. All right. Well, good. Well, I'll just launch in then. So normally this will be a little informal. Normally I would have like resources for you to go and, look up, but I didn't. That's all buried in my stuff for years because I haven't covered this stuff in a while. But we were talking about it at Tamar and people were interested. So it kind of spurred this on. But when I was educated in sex therapy as a marriage and family therapist, it's interesting because I was trained in this recruiting process of this identity confusion. They trained me how to do it, which is the best way to learn how they do it because they teach you what they do. And so I was trained originally in a very liberal environment where this happened. So one of the things that, when you use the word cult is that in the realm of statism, which is really how our children are educated, mainly in a public system, it's really statism, and it's really statism categories and organized recruiting systems into these patterns. And because you have statism that it relies on a certain amount of minority, status. They want to recruit as much minority and transgendered or gender confused people as they can because it just gives it more validity to push through their agenda. And I am not, you can ask Dr. Aylwine, I am the last person that's a conspiracy theorist. I'm not a prepper. I don't do that. But there really is this piece of recruiting in a socio-political realm. So the way that works is, where it would apply to sexual identity would be if in sex therapy we would learn about arousal, and part of the things to understand about arousal is we actually need to teach kids about arousal when they're like 12 and 13 so that they'll understand that you're going to encounter visual images that are going to arouse you. And that doesn't mean that you are a same-sex attracted person, that's a normal pattern of glandular response to things you're not used to seeing. That's the design of the human body. But when you get a kid and they're about 12 years old and they're starting to have, a hormonal maturation, they're starting to have arousals that they've not had previously. And at the same time, you have what we call differentiation, which is where you're at an age where you're actually starting to pull back a bit from your parents and be a little bit more individualized. You kind of have what's called the perfect storm when you have statism. So what you have is you have these category recruiting mechanisms that will pounce on that kid and say, if you have, and they get them at 9 now they start at 9, which is the perfect age for them to do it. And they'll say, if you're a girl and you see a naked woman and you're attracted to her, you don't need to be afraid of that. That is a seed planted. Don't be afraid of that. That's just who you are. Right? So that's the first thing you're told when you're 9 years old. Don't be afraid of that. Your parents might not understand, but just go with it and be yourself. And then they just start sort of recruiting you into a category. So because in our environment now, we have this overexposure to the form, the human form. You have your arousal patterns are very confused now, right? So we're really confused about arousal. It's just overstimulated all the time. So it's really hard to categorize or control, limit, dissect, analyze anything that is that overexposed and constantly you're having this serotonistic brain bath of sexual arousal all the time. So it's really, really hard to control it. So it's going to go haywire. You're going to have all these things happen. So the other piece of arousal in the brain is that things that are novel will go into your brain and they'll encounter like resistance. There's actually a physical resistance in your gray matter, in your brain. It's really interesting if you ever want to research it. It's fascinating. But the example I was using it tomorrow was we were talking about like music. So when you might hear a song and when you hear a song and you love it the first time you hear it, you're like, oh, I just love the way that chord progression goes. It just feels good. And what that's doing is it's encountering a little resistance in your brain and your brain gets excited because it's getting resistance. And so you know how it is, you play that song over and over and you get kind of sick of that song and then you don't like it anymore because that's not causing arousal anymore. Even though the chord progressions haven't changed, these ridges have become deeper in your brain and there's no resistance. You develop a little resistance over time, like say you don't hear that song for a year and you hear it again, you're like, oh, I remember that song, I love it, but then you get sick of it quicker. Do you know what I'm saying? Does that ever happen to you? And you get sick of it quicker. So there's less resistance, that ridge is there. But once this arousal pattern is formed, this novelty is kind of like encountering resistance in your brain and you get the perfect storm. You get the group of recruiters that say, this is who you are. You're part of this group now. Don't let these people press on you and tell you you're not who you are when they're at the stage of individuation and differentiation where they need to feel like they're kind of a little separate. So you can see how that's the perfect storm to imprint on children and cause a deep-seated confusion that could lead to a homosexual lifestyle their whole entire life, where if they were just told, you might see a girl and be a girl and then get kind of like a little hot and flustered, and that's okay. And you'll get through that. But men will be more what you want. If they just had that, like that's okay, that's normal. But they don't. They have the opposite. And then you have, the religious sect that doesn't want to even talk about that at all because that sentence I said right now is highly controversial and upsetting to most people. So you see how that can work. You can see how this sort of pattern imprints on the kids. And then there's this sort of a connection that happens where this sexual impulse is paired with their socio-political category where they belong. And then that's just married, right? So that's just married. So then you're having to extricate that out of this confused arousal state with this individuation category and with your peer group and all the things you were taught. And so what they do in schools, which is really sad, but I've seen this, is they say to boys, okay, so you're kind of attracted to this guy. And really what they're having is what they call a boy crush, which is actually where men emulate other men or boys, because like, oh, he's more muscular, I want to be muscular. There's a normal pattern of that passes. That's not like forever. And they've had these teachers, they would teach the kids, certain ways, get through your squeamishness of it, do this in the same room. You can picture the activity because it's going to help you get through these hurdles. Okay, they actually push it like that. So if you can just really understand how these things are becoming paired and normalized and then put with this category. So that's just sort of that whole, if you think of Molech like as a cult, it's a recruiting system with its own rituals, with its own rules, with its own, I belong to this group identity. It's all the same thing, right? It's all the same thing to confuse and pervert and subvert all of those inclinations that were, it's sad, isn't it? It's really, when you say it in a lump like that, it's like, kind of almost takes your breath away. But is that helpful? Is there anything else, Melissa? Let's
see. There it is. I'm not used to unmuting myself. Yeah, and I think the ground we covered that night had to do with just the multitude of images that are coming into a young person. And And you mentioned it just now, but if you could maybe draw that out a little bit, because I really want them to see how the brain is just overloaded and it's
Yeah.
losing kind of that ability to know what's arousing and why.
Yes, that is so true. And that's why you're having the Viagra generation, is because of overexposure. And so when you press that button so many times, you have to keep turning up the volume to get the same arousal point. And so that is what happens in pretty much everyone's sex life on some level, that, you know, the more you get together, the more, you know, you might play a little bit, but this is with kids. And eventually, this is why you have a lot of men that struggle with their arousal with their wives, because it's not like it used to be when we didn't just have a big billboard of a half naked woman everywhere we go. And or the opposite is where you have just denim skirts. You see where you're gonna go either way. It's like, well, I think I want to look at that billboard because I don't know if I want that, you know. And so there's where you're getting really a lot of this confusion. But that's where you have male pattern arousal failure, because they're just overstimulated all the time. And then also because we don't have the same need for survival as in more ancient times, where there's a more organic approach to sexuality. Really, it's more organic back then than now. Like we were even saying it tomorrow, as we were talking about how movies are just images put together with very psychologically moving music, exactly timed when it should, to make it feel like it should be a certain thing. And life isn't that way. It doesn't come with a musical score, and it isn't resolved in 90 minutes. And so we feel unfinished and incomplete, and kids feel like they can't abandon this identity they've taken on, or they're betraying themselves. You know what I mean? So you're just and you get men like they're, you know, going off on their wives because all this. So I'm not giving anyone any excuses. I'm just saying that's the arousal failure that we are finding in marriages now. And that's why pornography is just so rampant, even in like believers' marriages, because they're so confused and they're just so overstimulated. And it takes so much more to reach arousal points to not let the marriage fail and not let the sex go. So all of those things are just so challenging. And because you usually have, you're either in a school system where the school takes care of it in a disgusting way, or you have the religious sect that ignores it, or you have the therapeutic sect that just would treat it. You just have a very slim margin of health there if you're going to look for that, to get help with that. But pretty much every couple deals with it. You know, and I was even mentioning it tomorrow. I remember when I was watching that movie Xanadu with Olivia Newton-John, if you ever remember that. I think I was like 11 when that came out, and she like comes out of a wall roller skating or dancing or whatever, and she was really beautiful. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, she's so beautiful. I just really think she's beautiful. If I had been in like a public school like now, and I mentioned that, they would have recruited me into a group to have a private talk with a counselor. And they would have been like, okay, so you're gay, and that's okay. You know, like, that's fine. You know, you're part of this group. Do you know who's gay? Beyonce, whatever they're going to say, you know. But anyway, but that is that cult ritual mentality of Molech. It just really does fit, doesn't it? Statism just fits it to a T.
Yeah, and I think that's, you pointed out the two extremes. We have secular society, which is overstimulated, so it's absolutely worn out those centers in the brain. I know, you know, when you go through menopause, one thing they ask you about is like, do you, is it adrenal fatigue? Is that what they call it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, your adrenaline has just been dealing with the stress of everyday life in this generation. I mean, our grandparents pretty much had to know how to plow a straight line and how to can tomatoes.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have to remember a million passwords. We have to update our software. We have to figure out how our phones work. You know,
Yeah.
every day there's new learning. And, you know, our adrenal glands, there's things in our body that are just overworked, trying to cope and to incorporate and to adapt. And then, like you said, the blue jean skirt, we have certain hyper-Orthodox religious cultures where if a man sees a woman's arm past the elbow, it's considered lewd.
Yeah.
And so I think, the Torah gives us some great boundaries so that we're not wearing things out by overexposure and overstimulation, because there's very specific sexual boundaries for a husband and wife. But yet within those boundaries, I think it preserves that intimacy much longer than maybe where there's no boundaries and constant stimulation. Some of it we can't help. We have to check out in the grocery store,
Yeah.
They're going to plant that stuff right where you have to stand and look at it.
Yeah.
But, by controlling maybe music that we listen to or movies that we watch, or, sometimes like pornography, we don't purposely put it on our internet, but just like with Fox News one night, I pulled up a news article and there's a naked woman. And so, I complained, and they actually took the ad down, which was,
Wow.
that surprised me, because I figured they would just say, religious freak and keep going. But I don't pull up a news article to see a naked lady or a naked man, But
you have like the women that are terrified of ever looking good at all, and they're not fully in touch with their femininity and how that can be for their husband. And they're basically a slave to fashion as much as maybe someone might say I was with my big, huge closet of clothes. Like, you know what I mean? The slave to fashion can mean a couple things, but it's really where you're a slave to an ideal. And, I can't go outside of this. I have to wear a denim pinafore. I have to look as bad as I possibly can so I can be holy, which of course in the Bible, the female form is very celebrated. And, the male form, I mean, it's described, right? It's not, the Bible's not this sterilized book we think it is. It's really got the passion and all of those things. But of course, like you're saying, it's all in context. And it's so potent because it's rare when it is there and it pops right out at you, and you're not having to just be like you're saying, the adrenals and, just the sex chemicals, those ridges form, and it takes so much more to create arousal. You've got to do this, and then you do that, and then a year later you got to start adding this, you got to start adding that, because we have really lost touch.
Yeah. And the thing is, to just because, like you're saying, you might admire something in the same or the opposite sex does not define you as
Right.
In terms of, really, isn't it your DNA that tells you whether you're male or female?
Yes.
And we can't change that. There's no changing your DNA or whatever it is, the X and the Y chromosomes or whatever it is that makes a man and a woman a woman. But maybe, how would you suggest, like with children, not so much saying, okay, if you like these toys, these are boy toys and these are girl toys, and somehow reading things into that? How do we avoid that so that we allow that child to maybe enjoy something that we typically associate with the opposite sex, like maybe going hunting? As an example, I was watching one of those game warden shows, and they caught a female hunter in a violation. They said, we hardly ever have this. Why? Because females don't go hunting by themselves that often, and so they don't have that many violations. That didn't make her a man.
Right. Well, it's funny. There's an irony to that, because you have this society that's pretending they're very upset with any genderization, and yet the girl that wants to shoot the bullseye instead of play with the Barbies is genderized. Oh, you must be more male. But there's a range and a continuum of things people enjoy based on their experiences of safety and how they want to approach the world. And it has nothing to do with their sex life. You know what I mean? So women can be a range of things, and it doesn't affect their sex life. So that's just where everything gets linked back to sex. If you like cars when you're a girl, you must want to have sex with girls. It's like, that is just not true. And a lot of people that had been recruited into these systems, when they got older, got help, and they extinguished these faulty connections, and they were able to restore proper connections, and they actually went on to have very healthy, good relationships, though a lot of pain and confusion. I mean, it took a decade of therapy to undo all of these things, right? Because it's just so hard. Takes a very patient new spouse to embrace all that happening. But you're right. So it's an irony there about genderism. And you know what? You've got this thing where you get all these celebrities, and they're like, "Oh, I'm raising my girl or my boy as it." How is that healthy? Like, what are you doing? You know what? You just that whole idea of just sterilizing gender and homogenizing gender is genderizing in of itself. It doesn't mean you need to push like dolls on your girls, but in sex therapy, you know, they really encourage us like to have a neutral upbringing. But how do you teach a girl how to be a girl, and the purity laws and the way that she is to be an Ezra Kenegdo and a supporter and a warrior of her own type if she isn't allowed to be a girl? And why does science not have the right to be true anymore? Because politically it can't be. So it's ironic.
Okay. Well, one more thing, and I didn't warn you about this beforehand, so you can take a pass if you don't want to answer. But, you know, what really got to me as I was preparing the lesson last week is I don't think I know anybody who's not been affected in their family or friends with someone who has chosen a gay lifestyle. I don't know if we're calling it a lifestyle or now, I don't know all the correct terms, but we love that person very much. And we know that that relative is fearfully and wonderfully made. And yet we're reading through these Torah portions that are telling us that this is a death cult. How would you advise people to pray through that dilemma of embracing the loved one while at the same time rejecting the behavior?
Well, I generally approach that with maybe a little bit of a different view. I have gay friends that I love dearly. And I personally don't struggle with the homosexual lifestyle, so it's hard for me to speak to it. So I own that. I can't tell this person I know how you feel. But I look at the person, so that I would never say this to them because it would sound condescending, but I look at them as a victim of society and what society has perpetrated on them and everything that's been, you know, all this stuff. So, okay, this might be a little controversial. You guys can just take this with a grain of salt. But we can say what's right or wrong because the Bible tells us what's right or wrong, right? If that word is an abomination, we know it's wrong. But only God eats off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So only God can say what's good and evil. So you can be wrong and not evil like the midwives. So does God say it's wrong? Yes. But is this kid a victim from 9 years old and lived this thing? And will Yeshua restore this person in the way he's going to do it? You know, we can't even speak to that. That's not even our concern. But so I'm not saying anything's not wrong or not a sin. But what's good and evil isn't up to me. And how they have been manipulated and hurt since they were a kid, or molested and hurt and harmed, and all the things that happen that usually are precursors and predictors of these lifestyles. So I always I take myself out of that equation of trying. I don't eat off that tree and think I can assign good or good or evil. Like I can't. I can assign right or wrong. If they ask me, what do you think about that? I will say, well, I don't struggle with it. Why are you asking me? Why don't you ask somebody who struggles with it? Well, we would like to know your opinion. Well, if the Lord says this is an abomination, I'm not going to disagree with him. So I handle it that way. I'm very careful. I could run for Congress talking to gay people because I really don't want to hurt their feelings. And I really also have to stand with what the word says. It's a tricky walk, but that's kind of how I view it.
Okay.
Is that a little controversial, but
tough times we live in.
Yeah, it's a weighty matter that is too weighty actually for me to weigh out. That's why I usually try to pass on it with people. I just say, well, I don't struggle with it. If you know what, if I had some other issue, you know, I have many weaknesses. Go on one of those. Let's talk about that. I'm going to tell you how I deal with this because I can assign, you know what I mean? I can understand these things. But that just isn't an area I struggle with.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, I hope it'll encourage some people just to understand that, there's so many forces at work in the world today. We have to acknowledge we live in a mixed field and we don't control the field.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It is a mixed field. And just like when I was talking about the perfect storm of the kids' individuation and the adrenal response and the form and the all of the sexual maturation all happening at the same time, surrounded, you just couch it in statism, you got a confused child. So there's mercy for that damage, I think, but.
Right. And, that's what I like about what it says in the millennium, is that the adversary is going to be bound for 1,000 years, which means he won't be able to deceive people anymore, which really takes away the element of confusion.
Yeah.
And then it makes choices much clearer when you know the person is not confused. And it seems to me that's what's dominating today, is confusion.
And that's the word ashamed, is confounded. In the garden, they were naked and they were not confounded. They had clarity. They didn't struggle with all that stuff, which is now such an enormous part of the divide between believers and non-believers. This one issue just separates everybody, and you can see it. They weren't confused. They weren't confounded.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Robin.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Appreciate it. Okay, guys, tell you what I'll do. I'll just do it on a PowerPoint. How's that? I want to look at some scriptures again. We want to, like I said last week, we talked about the cult of Molech as it applied to sexual abominations. And then we said, remember that it appears again in Kedoshim, or holies, an interesting turn of phrase, because we know it says you shall not pass your seed, your zera, to Molech. And then in this week's Torah portion, where does it say? Chapter 19, verse 19. And you can see the context very clearly right here. It says, you shall observe my statutes. You shall not mate your animal with another species. You shall not sow your field with mixed seed. And a garment that is a mixture of combed fibers shall not come upon you. All right, so again, as it'll go through here, and I'll pull up the scriptures, a section of them that I want to look at so we can get the context there for the occult, mediums, wizardry, sorcery, calling up dead things. It's going to put it in another context for us. But I think that idea of don't sow your field with mixed seed. Don't confuse the seed. And then in the passage we read last week, Yeshua was talking about the seed are the sons of the kingdom, and the field is the world. So unless we live in a very closed religious culture, and even then, I don't know how far you would have to go to get completely away from the tares in the field of the world. Even then, you're still having to deal with a mixed field of the world. And it's getting harder and harder to find, mates for your sons and daughters out there in the field. People of like kind and like mind. So let me go to a screen share. And play from start. And okay, Tashunda told me how to do this. There it goes. Okay. And probably, if you have a chance, I've got the Torah readings up here. That 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I hope to go over that with tomorrow's class. But in the meantime, if you'd like to read that on your own, I think you'll see it's kind of a mirror here of this Torah portion. So what we're going to see And this Torah portion is a repetition of the 10 Commandments. And like we said, we're talking about the cult of Molech. We know it's a cult of death. We know that the commandments are life. It says the commandment is holy. And so what is the difference between obeying commandments and disobeying commandments? The difference is life and death. And I did a creation conference with Brad Scott last weekend, and he brought some things out. He did more of the natural creation, and I did more of the prophetic nature of Genesis 2. But I think when we put those two things together, I got a much clearer picture of how those two fit together. And I began to wonder, because, you know, Brad talks about things like quarks and quantum physics and, you know, magnetic forces and things like that I really don't understand. But I got to thinking about it on the way home, and I thought, what if wanting us to keep the Father's commandments on the Father's part goes even beyond, or maybe it's, I don't know if it's even beyond, maybe it's closer than in terms of the natural. If the laws of life are set up in such a way that from a strictly scientific level, I know we make it very much a matter of theology and ethics and so forth. This is why we should keep the commandments. We love the Father. It's a relationship. But what if, even at its most basic level, if obeying commandments is what life is, and he knows that disobeying them is what death is? I mean, and I know we already get that picture in Scripture. That's not like a new revelation. But what if, you know, at the very molecular level, that's how life on earth really works? So that was just something I've been stewing on. But in the commandments, especially in this week's Torah portion, Kedoshim, which is the holies, we see the relationship of the father, the mother, the child, and the neighbor. And we'll maybe talk about some equivalent expressions in the neighbor so we get a better idea of who that neighbor or friend or brother might actually be. And you're going to see some repetition of themes. So I didn't want to take time and read the entire Torah portion, but I wanted to put some things on here where you could pick up the main themes that we're hopefully at the end going to be able to tie together. It says, speak to all the congregation of the sons of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And again, we're springing off that platform of Acharemot, which deals with the death of Nadab and Abihu. They died in the holy place. Why did they die in the holy place? Because they were disobedient. And we'll go into some of the mistakes that they made. But life, the being alive, being a living creature, is associated with maintaining some level of holiness. And the pattern is going to be, the greater my level of holiness, then the closer that I can penetrate into the holier spaces of the divine presence. So he wants us close. He wants us as close as we can come without it killing us, so to speak. So he says, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall reverence his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. All right, see the juxtaposition right there between reverencing your mother and your father and keeping the Sabbaths. Those two things have something in common. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves molten gods. I am the Lord your God. Now, when you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, you shall offer it so that you may be accepted. So when you make an offering, when you make a sacrifice, especially a peace offering, the idea there is so that what you are offering is important because it represents you. You want him. Remember how it talks about Cain and Abel, and Adonai had respect for Abel's offering. He accepted the offering, and therefore he accepted Abel. He did not have respect to the offering of Cain, which means that he rejected Cain, because what you bring does represent you. And we're going to see this pattern when we start talking about demons and pagan gods, which a pagan god is a demon in most cases, or it's a distortion of something that's just a servant of Adonai and has somehow been elevated to a position of deity when it is not. It's just a servant. And you can see that angels in Scripture are very concerned with not being confused with the Holy One. They'll say, I am just a servant. Please do not confuse me. They don't want to be, number one, confused with the Holy One. And number two, they don't want to be worshiped like a demon. And so the same pattern here is going to apply when people make a sacrifice or an offering. And we're going to look specifically at some things like foods and drinks, incense, possibly oils. Now, I know incense and oils are a big thing right now in Hebrew roots, so I'll give some clarity to that. I'm not saying don't use essential oils. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you need to know the source of that and why it was actually compounded. So we'll look at some specifics here. Why? Because when you put this offering, this peace offering out to the Lord, you are in essence sharing a meal with him. Same thing is going to be true with demons. When you put these foods out there, he's not going to physically eat them. But there is something behind that offering that he does feed on. So I want to look at that, and that might help us make some better choices, or at least validate our choices when it comes to watching, like if you send your child to a public school and you know they're having a Halloween party, why it's really important not to let those children eat that candy, why it's really important not to let your children eat leftover chocolate Easter bunnies, why it's really important for your children not to be eating Christmas tree cookies. And that's where Paul's comments to the Corinthians are going to make a whole lot of sense, because of what is represented by that food. And that food is actually an active invitation to demons. And that's hard to say. We don't want to see demons around every corner. And I don't think we have to. But we do have to be very careful about things like foods, drinks, aromas are going to be something we have to watch out for, even music. Those sorts of things are basically demon bait. And you might not even know you're putting the bait out, and the influence you're actually giving it a foothold in your home and in your life when you're not very careful about those things the way that Scripture commands us to be. It says, you shall not eat anything with the blood, nor practice divination or soothsaying. Again, it's a demonic sort of prophecy to divine or to soothsay. And in order to do this, you're trying to contact dead spirits. Now, a dead spirit has its own living reality. But because of its state of separation, because of the way that it's made, it's still a dead thing, even though it has a consciousness and it can do some things. it's still in the realm of the dead. And when you contact that realm of the dead, again, you've become demon bait. The door's open and you might as well hang out a welcome banner. It says, you shall not make any cuts in your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourself. I am the Lord. Now, the good news is with the tattoos, the rabbis say it's only wrong once, at the time that you do it. If the context here holds true, then what a tattoo actually does, again, it's like bait for demons. The demon can see these tattoo marks. Now, we still do it. In old times, they may have had a tattoo in memorial of a dead person, right? You don't put that in your body. You have prescribed things that you're supposed to do with your body when a loved one passes away. However, if you exceed that which is commanded, and the excess here is going to come out of strong emotion, typically, in your grief, you might unwittingly do something like get a memorial tattoo. Nevertheless, you're attracting the realm of the dead. You're trying to stay in contact with the dead in some way. And that's why you say, it's for lack of knowledge that people perish. It's for lack of knowledge that they are playing games with dead things. And I don't think it's any accident that there's so many movies and TV shows and things about walking dead people and zombies. And but look, we opened the door. Remember Bewitched way back at the beginning of color TV? And we thought it was cute for a little girl to go twinkle, twinkle, twinkle with her nose and do witchcraft. And it was so innocent. But what did it do? It made us into demon bait. And so now the things that we're seeing in movies and television is much more sinister. It's much more blatant attempts to access the realm of the dead. And there seems to be a strange pattern of people who actually do die, who have had, I don't remember what movie it was. Was it Poltergeist? I read an article somewhere that said how many people had died strange deaths after the filming of a certain movie. Maybe it was Poltergeist or something. But this is for our life. It's not so that we won't have fun with our friends on Saturday night and all go get matching tattoos. It's because he loves you and he wants you to live. And so he says, don't get this tattoo on your body. Now, if you repent of that tattoo, then I don't believe that that demon has the same access. Let's move on. I know we've got a lot of ground to cover, not a lot of time, but I felt like opening that way would clarify a little bit last week before we turn to the death cult. It says, don't profane your daughter by making her a harlot. Harlotry is going to be one of the themes here, which I should have been telling you what I wanted you to remember. We're looking at holiness. We're looking at reverence for father and mother. We're looking at idolatry. We're looking at offerings. And that category is going to include food, drink, and so forth, incense, blood. And then what we would say is the occult, divination, soothsaying, gashing, cutting yourself is sorcery, tattoos, making marks on your flesh. And then we kind of shift and we say, well, this is kind of something different, but it won't be. I think when we tie it up, you'll see how all these kind of disjointed things really aren't disjointed. It says, don't profane your daughter by making her a harlot, so that the land will not fall to harlotry and the land become full of lewdness. All right, now we see the connection with the previous Torah portion, which put passing your children in the fire to Molech in the context of lewdness. So these practices of playing with the dead, the realm of death, is going to be on a similar plane with sexual perversion and lewdness. You shall keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or spiritists. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. So again, he's turning back to the occult, not really changing topics now that we know that the topic goes all the way back to acharei mot, or after the death. We're still on the subject of death. So we've got the mediums and the spiritists. These are people who are going to try to contact the dead on your behalf. They are going to try to open the door or step into the door between the realm of life and death. And he says, if you seek them out, you're going to be defiled by them, which makes you think of Yeshua's statement about, the person who has an unclean spirit. He's been defiled by an unclean spirit. You might clean it out, but he'll go get 7 worse than himself. You're playing with powerful forces. When you start playing with Ouija boards, even at the fair, somebody wants to read your palm, wants you to do tarot cards. Stay away. Just stay away. He says, I am the Lord your God. You shall rise up before the gray-headed and honor the aged. You shall revere your God. I am the Lord. Okay, old people. It's very similar to the commandment to reverence your mother and your father. It says, any man from the sons of Israel or from the aliens sojourning in Israel who gives any of his offspring to Molech shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. So if we collectively took these 2 Torah portions and looked at the major categories that we've kind of maybe artificially separated into sexual perversion and death cult, or the occult, when we stand back at a distance, we see that both of those are the result of giving your offspring, your seed, to Molech. And it says you will surely be put to death. Why? Because you're dealing with the realm of death. You're choosing it. Again, is it more than scientific? Of course, there's this ethical love relationship with the Father. But I think on a very simple level, when you do these things, you're basically digging the hole deeper and deeper and deeper. He says, I will also, I'm not sure if I switched to chapters or not. Yeah, I switched to chapter 20, verse 1. He says, I will also set my face against that man and will cut him off from among his people because he has given some of his offspring to Molech, so as to defile my sanctuary and to profane my holy name. And here's what we'll get at. I know we probably won't get at it till tomorrow, but when you're looking at what happens in Jerusalem, in the temple, or let's say we're talking about the tabernacle, the essence of that area is holiness. And it's in that area of holiness that the priest, it says, he offers the food of your God. And we know that God doesn't literally eat the food any more than a demon actually eats the food that's offered to it. It's what's going on behind the food. It's the effort and the intent put into the food. So if the whole point of this holy place called Jerusalem is to bring the divine holy presence down to that place, then you can see why if you're introducing a death cult and death practices into that place, then in essence, you are preventing him from descending. and it is profaning his holy name. Again, that Shin is embedded right over the city of Jerusalem, El Shaddai. If the people of the land, however, should ever disregard that man when he gives any of his offspring to Molech so as not to put him to death, you see, here you're going to see a responsibility to act. Right? Here's where I'm with Tashanda in principle. If we don't speak up against certain practices in our land, then now we're in violation because we stayed silent, that we did not stop the bloodshed, or we did not attempt to. We can't stop it ourselves, but that we disregarded is the way that it's worded here. We can't disregard when we see children being passed through the fire to Molech. We can't disregard when we see sexual immorality being basically legislated. We can't disregard if we see death cults being introduced into the lives of our children. We can't disregard it. We have to speak up and we have to take a stand. He says, if you disregard it so as not to put him to death, then I myself will set my face against that man and against his family. And I will cut off from among their people both him and all those who play the harlot after him, by playing the harlot after Molech. Now you see this theme of harlotry popping up again, specifically in the context of Molech. As for the person who turns to mediums and to spiritists to play the harlot after them, I will also set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people. You shall consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy. In other words, being holy is a status of life. And therefore, these other things put you in the status of death. He says, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my statutes and practice them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. When he sanctifies us, he makes us holy. He can draw us into those holier places of his presence. He says, if there's anyone who curses his father or his mother, he shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother. See that theme popping up again? His blood guiltiness is upon him. If there is a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, one who commits adultery with his friend's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. If there is a man who lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Okay, that's a repetition. That's connecting us thematically back to Acharemot, which talks about the lewdness, uncovering your father's nakedness. So we can see this, it seems like a jumble of things, but it really isn't, because we can distill it all down in terms of the cult characteristics. But in terms of the life commandments, we can distill it all down to father, mother, child, and neighbor, or friend. Sometimes it'll say friend instead of neighbor. So let's look at a couple of pages of chart here. I could only get 5 on each one. But I wanted to show you the difference between the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20 and the 10 Commandments in Leviticus 19, which is where we are tonight in Kedoshim. So you'll have usually a more brief example in Exodus, and it was more concise, by the way, more concise summary in Exodus 20, or a more concise list. But when you get to Kedoshim, when you get to Leviticus 19, you can see in several cases here, he's clarifying. And if you actually read the whole text of Leviticus 19, there would be even more clarification than just what I put on the comparison chart. So the first commandment there, I am the Almighty your God, I am the Almighty your God, that's verbatim. The next one, you shall have no other gods. Remember, a god that is not God is just blanket category. The rabbis say these are dead things. So you shall have no other gods. But then the clarification in Leviticus 19 says, so don't make it for yourself, right? And what do you do when you make something for yourself? You tailor it to suit yourself, right? In ancient times, there was always lots of gods and goddesses, so you could pretty much pick from the buffet according to what you wanted. It wasn't necessarily a relationship of like, we pray to Adonai and say, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Whatever your will is for me, that's what I accept upon myself. But the multiple gods allowed you to make specific requests for, you know, your grocery list. What are the things I want? So basically, all the God is a reflection of yourself. So he says, don't make for yourself molten gods. You shall not take the name of the Almighty your God in vain. And then he clarifies over in Leviticus, he says, you shall not swear by my name falsely. That gets into lying and saying things like, God is my witness. Well, you better be really, really careful if you're saying things like, God is my witness, because that's one of the big 10. He says, remember the Sabbath day. But in Leviticus, he says, keep, guard, watch over. That's where we ran into trouble on the seventh day. Back at the beginning, is Adam and Eve didn't guard the garden. So it gave the serpent a foothold. In Exodus, he says, honor your father and mother. But in Leviticus 19, he says, every man shall fear. That's reverence, by the way. It can translate either way. Every man shall reverence his mother and father. And you'll see the switching there, but you're also seeing the switching to a different verb. There's a difference between honoring and reverencing. And so we'll look at that and say, why exactly did he switch it like that? You shall not murder, in verse 13 of Exodus. And so he clarifies in Leviticus, he says, neither shall you stand idly by the blood of your friend. Now we have some context. Remember, he says, if you're passing your children to Molech, and, you know, even if people disregard what you're doing, they're disregarding the blood that you're shedding, he himself will cut you off. He himself will deal with you. It's better for the people to get rid of the defilement, but if they don't, he will. So that clarification and context makes perfect sense. Not only do you have a responsibility not to murder, you have a responsibility to make sure justice is done. It says, you shall not commit adultery. And then he clarifies and says, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. And as we kind of extrapolate that onto the practice of idolatry, what we're going to see is that both the demon and the human that commits the idolatry, they will each be punished with death. And for the demon, it's going to be a death worse than already being dead. So, you shall not bear false witness. You shall not steal. No change to that. Although if you look at it in context, you'll get some more ideas about what it means not to steal. He says, you shall not bear false witness. And he clarifies that by saying, you shall not go about as a tale bearer, a slanderer. So that's a huge interpretation. You shall not bear false witness. We tend to put that in the context of a court case. But he says, no, everyday person, that means you shall not go about telling tales on people. And that's going to make a difference, because we're going to look at the usurper kings, the two sons who tried to usurp David's throne. And one of them had himself a king me party at a place called Ein Rogel, which means the spring of tail bearing. So I don't think anything's coincidental. It says, you shall not covet anything that is your friend's. In Exodus, in Leviticus, he clarifies, love your friend. Sometimes it's translated neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. So if you love your neighbor or your friend as yourself, then you're not going to see what they have as something to be acquired for yourself. Instead, you're going to be very happy that your neighbor, that your friend has what he or she has. So let's go back to this difference between honoring one's parents and reverencing them. First, the first mention, he says, honor your father and mother. And so the rabbis point out that this is kind of a pattern. And I can see it's true, because having worked in an all-male prison for 23 years, mom definitely gets the honor. When it comes to Mother's Day and Father's Day, there's no competition. Hands down, mom wins on Mother's Day. So honor your father and mother. Your natural inclination is to honor your mother more. Why? She's your comforter. She tends to be more gentle with you. And I think this is the tragedy of this gender confusion, is it really is confusing females, not just males, also females, concerning their roles. This you've come a long way, baby, it's tried to make women into men in the workplace, and we're not. Women are still women, even in the workplace. And when we look and we say, equal work, equal pay, it can get very convoluted. Women have strengths in certain areas that men typically do not, and vice versa, and they can be very complementary. And instead of making those strengths complementary, they have somehow tried to form a woman into a man. And unfortunately, women of this generation have bought into that, and they're trying very hard to be a man, to look like a man. I know my husband works up at the courthouse, and some days he processes people in through the security, and this couple came in. He thought it was a man and a woman. And, he said, sir, you'll have to put your keys and whatever's in your pocket in this container. And as it turned out, that's a woman. One of them is a female, but she looks every bit like a male. You could not tell any difference between her and the male. And she went ballistic. And then when he told me, I went ballistic, because I'm like, her whole point was she was trying to pass herself off as a male, and then she gets upset with you for calling her sir. That doesn't make any difference. This is what I mean about gender confusion. Instead of the Torah, it acknowledges the strengths that the father and the mother have and how the child can relate to those strengths. And so for the mother, she tends to comfort, and therefore you don't really have to tell a child to honor his or her mother. And honor there is kaved, which means glory, actually. To give weight and heaviness. It's like, the glory, the kavod descended upon the Mishkan. So he says, all right, your natural inclination is going to be to honor your mother. He says, let's switch that. I want you to really focus on also honoring your father and mother. Because it's more natural for you to honor your mother, I'm going to put the father first. But then when we get into this Torah portion, it swaps it out and uses a different word. It's revere or fear, but I think revere describes it better for English speakers. It switches and it puts the mother first. You are to reverence, you are to have respect for your mother and your father. Why? Because you tend to respect your father more because he's bigger. He's more powerful. He's more intimidating. So we tend to revere the father more. She says, okay, I'm going to switch it. And to show you that it's very important that you have a balanced honor and reverence for your parents, I want you to put mom first in this so that you'll remember to reverence her because you're naturally going to reverence your father. So the commandments are showing us the holy way, the life way, which is to balance honor and reverence through obedience to the commandments. Because the way that you honor and reverence your parents is going to reflect the way that you honor and reverence your heavenly Father. And we're going to say mother, for the sake of describing the Ruach HaKodesh, the comforter, right? So there's that balance of discipline and instruction. And so we're not to diminish the honor or the reverence that we give to each one of those aspects of the divine. So when you look at that, I'll flip back up here where you can see it. Let's see. Okay, the fifth, there's 10 commandments, right? So when we want to find the chiastic axis, the thing in the middle, we have to kind of start counting at the ends and start moving in. Sometimes it will be one thing. In this case, where you've got 5 and 5, it'll actually be 5 and 6. So we've got honor your father and mother, reverence your mother and father, followed by the other part of that, you shall not murder, neither shall you stand idly by the blood of your friend. So honor and reverencing your father and mother is connected to murder, not murdering. What does that mean? Basically, if you honor your parents, it'll lead you to honor life more than death. Because so many of these things we're reading in this Torah portion are simply ways to honor death. And then, again, every man shall fear his mother and father, neither shall you stand idly by the blood of your friend. If you reverence your parents, then it's going to lead you to defend a friend against slander or fires of the occult, the death cult. Right? So there's your chiastic middle of the 10 commandments. Honoring parents is an equivalent to not murdering, because you will learn to honor life if you do that. If you reverence your father and mother, then you will be more likely to speak up and defend the innocent. And that's what it says. Death and life, remember, are in the hand of the tongue. So you can take your tongue and you can slander and murder, or you can take the hand of your tongue and you can honor life and you can defend life. That's the chiasm. And it's going to go back to basically, and we'll have more time tomorrow to look at this. Your neighbor, your friend are going to be part of the essence of this honor, reverence, not murdering, speaking up against slander. So this is borne out even in the New Testament. It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. And the rabbis say that means so that you may live long, not just in this world, but in the world to come. It says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. Again, don't pass your children through the fire, right? Anger is fire. So we get a pattern here. When there is obedience, we have honor and we have life. The Torah instructions of life equal wellness and equal a living child. The fires of Molech equal anger, and they equal a dead child. Right? So Paul is teaching this pattern to the Ephesians. So again, so that it may go well with you, good with you, tov with you. That describes the creation. It was good, it was good, it was good. Why? Because everything was in order and everything was in obedience to the commandment to let there be whatever it was that was being called forth. So in Deuteronomy 5:23, you can see that Moses is putting this long life, again, back into the context of honoring parents. You shall walk in all the way which the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may be well with you, that it may be tov, that you may prolong your days in the land which you will possess. So do you see here how Moses takes what we've always probably read as your physical, natural mother and father? Yes, you should honor and respect them. But he's saying if you can do that the pattern there, if you can do that, then you can also honor and respect the commandments of the Lord your God. And when you keep the commandments of the Lord your God, at a very basic level, you are going to live and you're going to be tov. And when you live and you're tov, then your days in the land are prolonged. So that's the equivalent of walking all the way of the Torah, as Moses was summarizing it. Chaya, tov, that original state of creation in the garden, a state of life. And so in that original state, we have a pattern. We have living creatures, which are chayot, and we have those things which sustained their life in a state of good, or tov. Let me check time here right quick. Okay, we're over time, so I'm going to stop the share. And we've got enough here to talk about, I think. So let me stop the recording.